Hello and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. What's next for the Occupy movement across the U.S. after police use strong-arm tactics to disperse protesters? Should the movement seek a way to join the political process and to insert itself into legislative procedures, or will it eventually fragment into protest for protest's sake? To crosstalk the ongoing protests in the U.S., I'm joined by my guests in New York. James Livingstone, he's a professor of history at Rutgers and author of Against Thrift, Why Consumer Culture is Good for the Economy, the Environment, and Your Soul, published yesterday. Patrick Brennan, he is a writer and the William F. Buckley Fellow at the National Review Institute. And Frances Fox Piven, she is a distinguished professor of sociology and political science at City University of New York Graduate Center. All right, folks, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. But first, Masha, is this movement actually going anywhere?
I think that's the main question right now, is it? Over the 2 months that the Occupy Wall Street movement has existed, it's turned into a juggernaut of civil disobedience that has plowed through cities across the world. But just as the movement is growing in scale and scope, it is also grappling with more and more criticism, crackdowns, and facing growing questions about its tactics and strategy. The movement's advocates still insist that Occupy is an important voice for public frustration that has succeeded in raising awareness of staggering income and wealth inequality.
There is a movement brewing in America, not just the Occupy Wall Street, but the 2,000 encampments occupy around America, and also the sense that suddenly the 99% of Americans who have not been heard from are being heard from and heard in the media, which has not paid attention until now.
Indeed, the extent to which Occupy has gathered steam and resonated across the U.S. and the globe does say something about a collective sense of discontent and disillusionment with the economy. But whether that sense can be applied to all the 99% of Americans that the protests claim to represent is another story, and thus is shown in a recent opinion survey conducted by Public Policy Polling, which found that not only does Occupy appeal to merely a handful of the 99%, but its approval ratings have sagged over the last month. This growing wariness of Occupy probably stems from the real or perceived notion that the movement's outlook is redundantly utopian, while its members are yet to put forth clear and specific policy goals. And herein lies the protesters' chief task, proving they can convert their momentum into targeted action. But even if Occupy were to recede into the annals of social resistance, it would most likely leave behind the idea that the movement came to represent, namely that there is a wide disconnect between the government and on-the-ground reality. And that reality shows the Western economic system experiencing a deep systemic crisis. So perhaps the main purpose has already been served.
We'll see about that. First, Frances, I'd like to go to you in New York. You wrote, I think we desperately need a popular uprising in the United States. Is this the uprising you were hoping for? And where is this uprising, if it is, where is this uprising going?
This uprising is raising the issue of extreme inequality in the United States. That inequality of both wealth and income has increased steadily over the past 35 years. And it did not find real expression in the American political process. And it didn't find strong expression in the American political process because the very fact that wealth has become more concentrated has meant that the wealthy can pour more money into our electoral system. So even Democrats did not forcefully express the fact of increasing inequality, and people were left without even a clear articulation of what the problem was, what the problems are. When Occupy Wall Street began, it began rather small in New York City. It was the first clear and innovative expression of a big problem whose center was financial capitalism.
Okay, Patrick, what do you think about that? I mean, one of the things I find very interesting is that we reflect upon what Masha's report was. I mean, is it really about the 99%, or is it about a certain a type of person that is being disenfranchised in America's democratic system? Because, I mean, if it's 99%, why don't you just all register to vote and kick the bums out? But that's not what's happening.
No, it's quite clear that it really doesn't represent 99% of America. I mean, if you go down to Zuccotti Park, it doesn't look like 99% of America to me. And I think the polls bear that out. I mean, just yesterday, there was a USA Today Gallup poll that came out with support of just, I believe, 13% in support of and something like 30% against. The fact is that there was a great piece in the New Yorker yesterday that brought out what are the origins of the movement. And it's essentially, and not everyone involved in the movement believes in this, but it's essentially an anarchic anti-capitalist movement. And while many Americans are unhappy with our economic situation, I don't think that they blame that on the nature of capitalism. I think that's a pretty rare sentiment in America today. And so in that sense, 99% of us aren't against capitalism, and so I'm not sure they're really working out for our interests.
That's fair enough. James, if I can go to you, I mean, a lot of people would say capitalism isn't working for them.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. I think there are two questions here. One is the nature of politics. Register and vote for what? What happens in Congress if you vote for whomever? Nothing. To say that this movement has to get political is, to me, just laughable because the political process is so broken. It is so not just partisan, but ridiculously dysfunctional. So that's one thing. The other thing is the nature of capitalism. Americans have always been ambivalent about capitalism, the nature of it. Sure, yeah, I think the 99% are deeply, deeply worried about what's happening under this system that we call capitalism, like it or not. I think the 1%,
James,
the people right across the street from Zuccotti Park...
How you can be ambivalent about capitalism if you're so for a consumer society. I mean, how do you have a consumer society without capitalism?
James, you want to field that?
Well, sure. I'm ambivalent about capitalism because I think consumerism is a way of transcending or superseding capitalism. I think it's a way of reducing corporate profits, for example. If we redistribute income away from profits, away from corporations towards consumers, that's a good thing.
I don't think the movement raised the issue of capitalism.
Go ahead, Frances, jump in.
The movement did not raise the issue of capitalism. It raised the issue of concentrated wealth and income. It doesn't rail against capitalism, and it speaks about corporate financial wealth that has greatly concentrated in not only the top 1%, the top 10th of 1% in our society, and it asserts, actually pretty close to correctly, that most of the rest of the society is depleted as a result of the drift of wealth upward in the United States. It doesn't say capitalism must go. It doesn't chant.
Frances, I think this is very interesting here. I think it's very interesting here. My three guests here, we can't even decide really what this movement's all about. And James, I'd like to quote something that you wrote in something called Occupy Wall Street isn't the same old political crap. It's much, much more. I'm going to read a sentence from it here. The response to Occupy Wall Street tells us more about the limits of our political discourse than about the content of the protest or movement. Can you elaborate on that? Because it's very, very interesting. And you mentioned something else in the article about Eastern Europe, and I studied the Solidarity movement very, very carefully when I was a graduate student, and you're drawing parallels here, so it's very interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah. When I say it has something to do with the limits of our discourse, I mean, what is the limit, or what is the nature of politics? It seems to me Václav Havel got it right. He said dissidence, opposition, is not all there is to politics. In fact, what he said was living within the truth is a pre-political space. That's what I think is happening in Zuccotti Park. So yes, we might be able someday to translate this into political programs, but for the time being, that is not the point. The point is simply to allow these words to make more sense to more people, the 99% versus the 1%. If those words, if that vernacular, if these verbs and nouns get into the language, we have a way of thinking about the future that right now we don't.
Okay, Patrick, if I can go to you. It seems to me this movement knows what it doesn't like. It doesn't like oligarchy. It doesn't like concentration of wealth. I can go on and on. What does it want? What does it like? Because it's all telling us what they don't like. And that's why it's such a diffuse group.
I think that James was getting at what probably unifies the movement more than anything is the idea of sort of this kind of apolitical utopia based on consensus-based democracy. And so that's the whole movement revolves around these general assemblies, and they're sort of wonderful ideas, and basically, liberal commentators have looked down and said, that is beautiful. Unfortunately, it isn't like Tahrir Square, because Tahrir Square was a functional political protest with political aims, but they said, this is exhilarating, this is beautiful. And unfortunately, it doesn't represent anything that's particularly politically practical. And it's not an example of American democracy. That isn't what democracy looks like. Requiring consensus and paying attention to all viewpoints isn't really what democracy looks like, and it isn't what's made functional democratic societies work. But that is, I think, what ties all together is this faith in consensus. Which
okay, Frances, go jump in there because it is
actual history.
Go ahead.
Actually, social movements that looked something like Occupy Wall Street have been very, very important in American history. The American Revolution itself came out of a social movement in the United States. It wouldn't have triumphed without that social movement. The abolitionists set in motion the political currents which led to civil war and the emancipation of the slaves. The labor movement that flared up in the 1930s. These did not look like electoral representative politics. They had the distinctive dynamics of movements. Movements look, feel, and talk differently than campaign politics or elected politicians. And when you're so dismissive of the movement because it hasn't put out a series of legislative or programmatic goals, you're not comparing it to other movements. This movement has an incredible symbolic power because it has cut through the fog of gibberish and propaganda that has obscured the fact.
Frances, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Occupy movement. Stay with our team.
Wealthy British scion Zach Wilson, investment activist.
Markets, finance, scandal. Find out what's really happening to the global economy with Max Kaiser for a no-holds-barred look at the global financial headlines. Tune in to Kaiser Report on RT.